Section 3 of Genji Monogatari by Murasaki Shikibu. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Hahaki-gi, the broom-like tree. Part 2. It was the evil fortune of Sama no Kami to meet with too much jealousy in one of the ladies to whom he might otherwise have given his heart, while he could feel no confidence in another owing to flirtations. It was my hard lot to encounter an instance of excessive diffidence. I once knew a girl whose person was altogether pleasing, and although I too had no intention, as Sama no Kami said, of forming an everlasting connection with her, I nevertheless took a great fancy to her. As our acquaintance was prolonged, our mutual affection grew warmer. My thoughts were always of her, and she placed entire confidence in me. Now, when complete confidence is placed by one person in another, does not nature teach us to expect resentment when that confidence is abused? No such resentment, however, seemed under any circumstances to trouble her. When I very seldom visited her, she showed no excitement or indignation, but behaved and looked as if we had never been separated from each other. This patient silence was more trying to me than reproaches. She was parentless and friendless. For this reason responsibility weighed more heavily on me. Abusing her gentle nature, however, I frequently neglected her. About this time, moreover, a certain person who lived near her discovered our friendship, and frightened her by sending, through some channel, mischief-making messages to her. This I did not become aware of till afterwards, and it seems she was quite cast down and helpless. She had a little one, for whose sake, it appears, she was additionally sad. One day I unexpectedly received a bunch of nadeshiko flowers. They were from her. At this point Tono Chiûjiô became gloomy. "And what," inquired Genji, "were the words of her message?" "Sir, nothing but the verse, 'Forgot may be the lowly bed From which these darling flowerets spring, Still let a kindly dew be shed Upon their early nurturing.'" No sooner had I read this than I went to her at once. She was gentle and sedate as usual, but evidently absent and preoccupied. Her eyes rested on the dew lying on the grass in the garden, and her ears were intent upon the melancholy singing of the autumn rushi. It was as if we were in a real romance. I said to her, "When with confused gaze we view the mingled flowers on gay parterre, amid their blooms of radiant hue, the Tokonaz, my love, is there." And avoiding all allusion to the nadeshiko flowers, I repeatedly endeavoured to comfort the mother's heart. She murmured in reply, "Ah, flower already bent with dew, The winds of autumn cold and chill Will wither all thy beauteous hue, And soon, alas, unpitying, kill." Thus she spoke sadly, but she reproached me no further. The tears came involuntarily into her eyes. She was, however, apparently sorry for this, and tried to conceal them. On the whole, she behaved as if she meant to show that she was quite accustomed to such sorrows. I certainly deeply sympathized with her, yet still further abusing her patience. I did not visit her again for some time, but I was punished. When I did so, she had flown, leaving no traces behind her. If she is still living, she must needs be passing a miserable existence. Now, if she had been free from this excessive diffidence, this apathy of calmness, if she had complained when it was necessary, with becoming warmth and spirit, she need never have been a wanderer, and I would never have abused her confidence. But, as I said before, a woman who has no strength of emotion, no passionate bursts of sorrow or of joy, can never retain a dominion over us. I loved this woman without understanding her nature, and I am constantly, but in vain, trying to find her and her little darling, who was also very lovely; and often I think with grief and pain that, though I may succeed in forgetting her, she may possibly not be able to forget me, and surely there must be many an evening when she is disquieted by sad memories of the past. Let us now sum up our experiences and reflect on the lessons which they teach us. One who bites your finger will easily estrange your affection by her violence. Falseness and forwardness will be the reproach of some other, in spite of her melodious music and the sweetness of her songs. A third, too self-contained and too gentle, is open to the charge of a cold silence, which oppresses one, and cannot be understood. Whom, then, are we to choose? All this variety and this perplexing difficulty of choice seems to be the common lot of humanity. Where, again, I say, are we to go to find the one who will realize our desires? Shall we fix our aspirations on the beautiful goddess, the heavenly Kichijio? Ah, this would be but superstitious and impracticable. So mournfully finished Tono Chiûjiô, and all his companions, who had been attentively listening, burst simultaneously into laughter at his last allusion. "And now, Shikib, it is your turn. Tell us your story," exclaimed Tono Chiûjiô, turning to him. "What worth hearing can your humble servant tell you? Go on, be quick, don't be shy, let us hear." Shikib no Jiô, after a little meditation, thus began: "When I was a student at the university, I met there with a woman of very unusual intelligence. She was in every respect one with whom, as Sama no Kami has said, you could discuss affairs, both public and private. Her dashing genius and eloquence were such that all ordinary scholars would find themselves unable to cope with her, and would be at once reduced to silence. Now, my story is as follows. I was taking lessons from a certain professor who had several daughters, and she was one of them. It happened by some chance or other I fell much into her society. The professor, who noticed this, took up a wine cup in his hand and said to me, 'Hear what I sing about two choices.' This was a plain offer put before me, and thenceforward I endeavoured, for the sake of his tuition, to make myself as agreeable as possible to his daughter. I tell you frankly, however, that I had no particular affection for her, though she seemed already to regard me as her victim. She seized every opportunity of pointing out to me the way in which we should have to steer, both in public and private life. When she wrote to me, she never employed the effeminate style of the kana, but wrote, oh, so magnificently! The great interest which she took in me induced me to pay frequent visits to her, and, by making her my tutor, I learned how to compose ordinary Chinese poems. However, though I do not forget all these benefits, and though it is no doubt true that our wife or daughter should not lack intelligence, yet, for the life of me, I cannot bring myself to approve of a woman like this, and still less likely is it that such could be of any use to the wives of high personages like yourselves. Give me a lovable nature in lieu of sharpness. I quite agree with Sama no Kami on this point." "What an interesting woman she must have been!" exclaimed Tono Chiûjiô, with the intention of making Shikib go on with his story. This he fully understood, and, making a grimace, he thus proceeded: "Once, when I went to her after a long absence, a way we all have, you know, she did not receive me openly as usual, but spoke to me from behind a screen. I surmised that this arose from chagrin at my negligence, and I intended to avail myself of this opportunity to break with her. But the sagacious woman was a woman of the world, and not like those who easily lose their temper or keep silence about their grief. She was quite as open and frank as Samo no Kami would approve of. She told me, in a low, clear voice, 'I am suffering from heartburn, and I cannot, therefore, see you face to face. Yet if you have anything important to say to me, I will listen to you.' This was, no doubt, a plain truth, but what answer could I give to such a terribly frank avowal? 'Thank you,' said I simply, and I was just on the point of leaving, when, relenting perhaps a little, she said aloud, 'Come again soon, and I shall be all right.' To pass this unnoticed would have been impolite, yet I did not like to remain there any longer, especially under such circumstances, so, looking askance, I said, 'Here I am. Then why excuse me? Is my visit all in vain? And my consolation is, you tell me, come again?' No sooner had I said this than she dashed out as follow, with a brilliancy of repartee which became a woman of her genius: 'If we fond lovers were, and meeting every night, I should not be ashamed, were it even in the light.' 'Nonsense, nonsense!' cried Genji and the others, who either were, or pretended to be, quite shocked. 'Where can there be such a woman as that? She must have been a devil. Fearful! Fearful! and snapping their fingers with disapproving glances, they said, "Do tell us something better, do give us a better story than that." Shikibu no Jiyo, however, quietly remarked, "I have nothing else to relate," and remained silent. Hereupon a conversation took place to the following effect. It is a characteristic of thoughtless people, and that without distinction of sex, that they try to show off their small accomplishments. This is, in the highest degree, unpleasant. As for ladies, it may not, indeed, be necessary to be thorough master of the 3 great histories and the 5 classical texts, yet they ought not to be destitute of some knowledge of both public and private affairs, and this knowledge can be imperceptibly acquired without any regular study of them, which, though superficial, will yet be amply sufficient to enable them to talk pleasantly about them with their friends. But how contemptible they would seem if this made them vain of it! The manner style and pedantic phrases were not meant for them, and if they use them, the public will only say, "Would that they would remember that they are women and not men," and they would only incur the reproach of being pedants, as many ladies, especially among the aristocracy, do. Again, while they should not be altogether unversed in poetical compositions, they should never be slaves to them, or allow themselves to be betrayed into using strange quotations, the only consequence of which would be that they would appear to be bold when they ought to be reserved, and abstracted when very likely they have practical duties to attend to. How utterly inappropriate, for instance, it would be on the May festival, if, while the attention of all present was concentrated on the solemnity of the occasion, the thoughts of these ladies were wandering on their own poetical imaginations about sweet flags, or if, again, on the 9th day festival, when all the nobles present were exercising their inventive faculties on the subject of Chinese poems, they were to volunteer to pour forth their grand ideas on the dew-laid flowers of the chrysanthemum, thus endeavouring to rival their opponents of the stronger sex. There is a time for everything, and all people, but more especially women, should be constantly careful to watch circumstances, and not to air their accomplishments at a time when nobody cares for them. They should practice a sparing economy in displaying their learning and eloquence, and should even, if circumstances require, plead ignorance on subjects with which they are familiar. As to Genji, even these last observations seemed only to encourage his reverie still to run upon a certain one, whom he considered to be the happy medium between the too much and the too little, and no definite conclusion having been arrived at through the conversation, the evening passed away. The long-continued rainy weather had now cleared up, bright and fine, and the Prince Genji proceeded to the mansion of his father-in-law, where Lady Ao, his bride, still resided with him. She was in her private suite of apartments, and he soon joined her there. She was dignified and stately, both in manners and demeanour, and everything about her bore traces of scrupulous neatness. Such may be one of those described by Sama no Kami, in whom we may place confidence, he thought as he approached her. At the same time, her lofty queenliness caused him to feel a momentary embarrassment, which he at once tried to hide by chatting with the attendant maid. The air was close and heavy, and he was somewhat oppressed by it. His father-in-law happened to pass by the apartment. He stopped and uttered a few words from behind the curtain which overhung the door. "In this hot weather," said Genji in a low tone, "what makes him come here?" and did not give the slightest encouragement to induce his father-in-law to enter the room. So he passed along. All present smiled significantly and tittered. "How indiscreet!" exclaimed Genji, glancing at them reprovingly, and throwing himself back on a kiosok arm-stool, where he remained calm and quiet. It was by no means becoming behaviour on the part of the Prince. The day was drawing to an end, when it was announced that the mansion was closed in the certain celestial direction of the Nakagami, central god. His own mansion in Nijiyo, the one mentioned as being repaired in the previous chapter, was also in the same line of direction. "Where shall I go, then?" said Genji, and without troubling himself any further, went off into a doze. All present expressed in different words their surprise at his unusual apathy. Thereupon someone reported that the residence of Ki no Kami, who was in waiting on the prince, on the banks of the middle river, the river Kyogok, had lately been irrigated by bringing the stream into its gardens, making them cool and refreshing. "That's very good, especially on such a close evening," exclaimed Genji, rousing himself, and he at once intimated to Ki no Kami his desire of visiting his house, to which the latter answered simply, "Yes." He did not, however, really like the prince's visit, and was reluctantly telling his fellow attendants that, owing to a certain circumstance which had taken place at Iyo no Kami's residence, his wife, Ki no Kami's stepmother, had taken up her abode with him that very evening, and that the rooms were all in confusion. Genji heard all this distinctly, but he would not change his mind, and said, "That is all the better. I don't care to stay in a place where no fair statue dwells. It is slow work." Being thus pressed, no alternative remained for the Ki no Kami, and a messenger was dispatched to order the preparation of apartments for the prince. Not long after this messenger had gone, Genji started on his way to the house of Ki no Kami, whose mild objections against this quick proceeding were not listened to. He left the mansion as quietly as possible, even without taking formal leave of its master, and his escort consisted of a few favorite attendants. The eastern front room in the dwelling quarters was wide open, and a temporary arrangement was made for the reception of the prince, who arrived there very quickly. The scene of the garden struck him before anything else. The surface of the lake sparkled with its glittering waters, the hedges surrounded it in rustic beauty, and luxuriant shrubs grew in pleasing order. Over all the fair scene the breeze of evening swept softly, summer insects sang indistinctly here and there, and the fireflies hovered about in mazy dances. The escort took up its quarters in a position which overlooked the stream of water which ran beneath the corridor, and here began to take cups of sake. The host hastened to order also some refreshment to be prepared for Genji. The latter was meanwhile gazing abstractedly about him, thinking such a place might belong to the class which Sama no Kami fairly placed in the middle category. He knew that the lady who was under the same roof was a young beauty of whom he had heard something before, and he was looking forward to a chance of seeing her. Then he noticed the rustling of a silken dress escaping from a small boudoir to the right, and some youthful voices, not without charm, were also heard, mingled with occasional sounds of suppressed laughter. The casement of the boudoir had been, until a short time before, open, but was pulled down by order of Ki no Kami, who, perhaps, doubted the propriety of its being as it was, and now only allowed a struggling light to issue through the paper of the sliding screen. He proceeded to one side of his room, that he might see what could be seen, but there was no chance. He still stood there, that he might be able, at least, to catch some part of the conversation. It seems that this boudoir adjoined the general family room of the female inmates, and his ears were greeted by some faint talking. He inclined his head attentively, and heard them whispering, probably about himself. "Is it not a pity that the fate of so fine a prince should be already fixed?" said one voice. "Yet he loses no opportunity of availing himself of the favours of fortune," added another. These remarks may have been made with no serious intention, but as to Genji, he, even in hearing them, could not help thinking of a certain fair image of which he so fondly dreamt; at the same time feeling a thrill on reflecting that, if this kind of secret were to be discovered and discussed in such a manner, what could be done? Then he heard an observation in delicate allusion to his verse, which he had presented to the Princess Momozono (Peach Gardens), with the flowers of Asagio (Morning Glory or Convolvulus). "What cautious beauties they are to talk in that way! But I wonder if their forms, when seen, will answer to the pictures of my fancy," thought Genji, as he retired to his original position, for he could hear nothing more interesting. Ki no Kami presently entered the room, brought in some fruits, trimmed the lamp, and the visitor and host now began to enjoy a pleasant leisure. "What has become of the ladies? Without some of them no society is cheerful," observed Genji. "Who can there be to meet such wishes?" said the Ki no Kami to himself, but took no notice of Genji's remark. There were several boys in the house who had followed Ki no Kami into the room. They were the sons and brothers of Ki no Kami. Among them was one about 12 or 13, who was nicer looking than the others. Genji, of course, did not know who they all were, and accordingly made inquiries. When he came to the last mentioned boy, Ki no Kami replied, "He is the youngest son of the late Lord Yimon, now an orphan, and, from his sister's connections, he is now staying here. He is shrewd and unlike ordinary boys. His desire is to take court service, but he has as yet no patron." "What a pity! Is then the sister you mentioned your stepmother?" "Yes, sir, it is so." "What a good mother you have got! I once overheard the Emperor, to whom I believe a private application had been some time made in her behalf, referring to her, said, 'What has become of her?'" "Is she here now?" said Genji, and lowering his voice, added, "How changeable are the fortunes of the world!" "It is her present state, sir, but, as you may perceive, it differs from her original expectation. Changeable indeed are the fortunes of this world, especially so the fortunes of women. Does Io respect her? Perhaps he idolizes her as his master." "That is a question, perhaps, as a private master. I am the foremost to disapprove of this infatuation on his part." "Are you? Nevertheless he trusts her to such a one as you. He is a kind father. But where are they all?" "All in their private apartments." Genji by this time apparently desired to be alone, and Ki no Kami now retired with the boys. All the escort were already slumbering comfortably, each on his own cool rush mat, under the pleasant persuasion of sake. Genji was now alone. He tried to doze, but could not. It was late in the evening, and all was still around. His sharpened senses made him aware that the room next but one to his own was occupied, which led him to imagine that the lady of whom he had been speaking might be there. He rose softly, and once more proceeded to the other side of the room to listen to what he might overhear. He heard a tender voice, probably that of Kokimi, the boy spoken of before, who appeared to have just entered the room, saying, "Are you here?" To which a female voice replied, "Yes, dear, but has the visitor yet retired?" And the same voice added, "Ah, so near, and yet so far. Yes, I should think so. He is so nice looking, as they say." "Were it daytime, I would see him too," said the lady in a drowsy voice. "I shall go to bed too. But what a bad light," said the boy, and Genji conjectured that he had been trimming the lamp. The lady presently clapped her hands for a servant, and said, "Where is Chiûjiô? I feel lonely. I wish to see her." "Madam, she is in the bath now. She will be here soon," replied the servant. "Suppose I pay my visit to her too? What harm? No harm, perhaps," said Genji to himself. He withdrew the fastening of the intervening door. On the other side there was none, and it opened. The entrance to the room where the lady was sitting was only screened by a curtain, with a glimmering light inside. By the reflection of this light he saw travelling trunks and bags all scattered about. Through these he groped his way, and approached the curtain. He saw, leaning on a cushion, the small and pretty figure of a lady, who did not seem to notice his approach, probably thinking it was Chiûjiô, for whom she had sent. Genji felt nervous, but struggling against the feeling, startled the lady by saying, "Chiûjiô was called for. I thought it might mean myself, and I come to offer you my devoted services." This was really an unexpected surprise, and the lady was at a loss. "It is, of course, natural," he said, "you should be astonished at my boldness, but pray excuse me. It is solely from my earnest desire to show at such an opportunity the great respect for you which I have felt for a very long time." He was clever enough to know how to speak, and what to say, under all circumstances, and made the above speech in such an extremely humble and insinuating manner, that the demon himself could not have taken offence, so she forbore to show any sudden resentment. She had, however, grave doubts as to the propriety of his conduct, and felt somewhat uncomfortable, saying shyly, "Perhaps you have made a mistake." "No, certainly not," he replied. "What mistake can I have made? On the other hand, I have no wish to offend you. The evening, however, is very irksome, and I should feel obliged if you would permit me to converse with you." Then, gently taking her hand, he pressed her to return with him to his lonely apartment. She was still young and weak, and did not know what was most proper to do under these circumstances, so half yielding, half reluctantly, was induced to be led there by him. At this juncture Chiûjiô, for whom she had sent previously, entered the room, upon which Genji exclaimed, "Ha!" Chiûjiô stared with astonishment at him whom she at once recognised as the Prince, by the rich perfume which he carried about him. "What does this mean?" thought Chiûjiô. She could still do nothing. Had he been an ordinary personage, she would have immediately seized him. Even in that case, however, there was enough room to doubt whether it would not have been better to avoid any violent steps, lest it might have given rise to a disagreeable family scandal. Hence Chiûjiô was completely perplexed, and mechanically followed them. Genji was too bold to fear bystanders, a common fault with high personages, and coolly closed the door upon her, saying, "She will soon return to you." The lady being placed in such an awkward position, and not knowing what Chiûjiô might imagine, became, as it were, bewildered. Genji was, however, as artful and insinuating as might be expected in consoling her, though we do not know where he had learnt his eloquence. This was really trying for her, and she said, "Your condescension is beyond my merit. I cannot disregard it. It is, however, absolutely necessary to know who is who." "But such ignorance," he said, a little abashed, rejoined, "as not to know who is the very proof of my inexperience. Were I supposed to understand too well, I should indeed be sorry. You have very likely heard how little I mix in the world. This perhaps is the very reason why you distrust me. The excess of the blindness of my mind seems strange even to myself." Thus he spoke insinuatingly. She, on her part, feared that if his fascinating address should assume a warmer tone, it would be more trying for her and more difficult to withstand; so she determined, however hard she might appear, not to give any encouragement to his feelings, and showed therefore a coolness of manner. To her meek character there was thus added a firm resolution, and it seemed like a young bamboo reed, with its strength and tenderness combined, difficult to bend. Still she felt the struggle very keenly, and tears moistened her eyes. Genji could not help feeling touched. Not knowing exactly how to soothe her, he exclaimed, "What makes you treat me so coolly? It is true we are not old acquaintances, but it does not follow that this should prevent us from becoming good friends. Please don't discompose yourself like one who does not know the world at all. It pierces my heart." This speech touched her, and her firmness began to waver. "Were my position what it once was," said she, "and I received such attention, I might, however unworthy, have been moved by your affection. But as my position in life is now changed, its unsatisfactory condition often makes me dream of a happiness I cannot hope to enjoy." Hereupon she remained silent for some moments, and looked as if she meant to say that she could no longer help thinking of the line, "Don't tell anyone you've seen my home." But these few moments of silence agitated the pure waters of her virtuous mind, and the sudden recollection of her aged husband, whom she did not generally think much about, occurred tenderly to her memory. She shuddered at the idea of his seeing her in such a dilemma as this, even in a dream, and without a word fled back to her apartment, and Genji was once more alone. Now the chanticleer began to proclaim the coming day, and the attendants rose from their couches, some exclaiming, "How soundly we have slept!" Others, "Let us get the carriage ready." Ki no Kami also came out, saying, "Why so early? No need of such hurry for the prince." Genji also arose, and putting on his naoshi, went out on the balcony on the southern side of the house, where he leaned upon the wooden balustrade and meditated as he looked round him. It appears that people were peeping out of the casement on the western side, probably being anxious to catch a glimpse of the prince, whose figure was indistinctly to be seen by them from the top of a short screen standing within the trellis. Among these spectators there was one who perhaps might have felt a thrill run through her frame as she beheld him. It was the very moment when the sky was being tinted by the glowing streaks of morn, and the moon's pale light was still lingering in the far distance. The aspect of the passionless heavens becomes radiant or gloomy in response to the heart of him who looks upon it; and to Genji, whose thoughts were secretly occupied with the events of the evening, the scene could only have given rise to sorrowful emotions. Reflecting how he might on some future occasion convey a message to the lady, and looking back several times, he presently quitted the house and returned to the mansion of his father-in-law. During some days succeeding the above events, he was staying at the mansion with his bride. His thoughts, however, were now constantly turning to the lady on the bank of the middle river. He therefore summoned Ki no Kami before him, and thus addressed him: "Cannot you let me have the boy, the son of the late Chiûnagon, whom I saw the other day? He is a nice lad, and I wish to have him near at hand. I will also introduce him to the Emperor." "I receive your commands. I will talk with his sister, and see if she consents to it," replied Ki no Kami with a bow. These last words, alluding to the object which occupied his thoughts, caused Genji to start, but he said with apparent calmness: "Has the lady presented you yet with a brother or a sister?" "No, sir, not yet. She has been married now these 2 years, but it seems she is always thinking she is not settled in the way her parents desired, and is not quite contented with her position. What a pity! I heard, however, she was a very good lady. Is it so?" "Yes, I quite believe so; but hitherto we have lived separately, and were not very cordial, which, as all the world knows, is usual in such relationship." After the lapse of 5 or 6 days, the boy Kokimi was brought to him. He was not tall or handsome, but very intelligent, and in manners perfectly well bred. Genji treated him with the greatest kindness, at which, in his boyish mind, he was highly delighted. Genji now asked him many questions about his sister, to which he gave such answers as he could, but often with shyness and diffidence. Hence Genji was unable to take him into his confidence, but by skilfully coaxing and pleasing him, he ventured to hand him a letter to be taken to his sister. The boy, though he possibly guessed at its meaning, did not trouble himself much, but taking it, duly delivered it to his sister. She became confused and thoughtful as she took it, and fearing what the boy might think, opened the letter and held it before her face in order to conceal the expression of her countenance. It was a long one, and among other things contained the following lines: "I had a dream so sweet. Ah, would that I could dream again! Alas, no sleep these eyes will greet, and so I strive to dream in vain." It was beautifully written, and as her eyes fell upon the passionate words, a mist gathered over them, and a momentary thought of her own life and position once more flashed over her mind, and without a word of comment to the boy, she retired to rest. A few days afterwards, Kokimi was again invited to join the prince. Thereupon he asked his sister to give him an answer to the prince's letter. "Tell the prince," she said, "there is no one here who reads such letters." "But," said the boy, "he does not expect such an answer as this. How can I tell him so?" At first she half resolved to explain everything to Kokimi, and to make him thoroughly understand why she ought not to receive such letters; but the effort was too painful, so she simply said: "It is all the better for you not to talk in that way. If you think it so serious, why should you go to him at all?" "Yet how can I disobey his commands to go back?" exclaimed the boy, and so he returned to Genji without any written answer to him. "I was weary of waiting for you. Perhaps you too had forgotten me," said Genji, when he saw the boy, who was, however, silent and blushed. "And what answer have you brought me?" continued Genji, and then the boy replied in the exact words which his sister had used. "What?" cried Genji, and continued: "Perhaps you may not know, so I will tell you. I knew your sister before she knew Iyo, but she likes to treat me so because she thinks she has got a very good friend in Iyo. But do you be like a brother to me. The days of Iyo will be probably fewer than mine." He now returned to the palace, taking Kokimi with him, and, going to his dressing room, attired him nicely in the court style. In a word, he treated him as a parent would do. By the boy's assistance, several more letters were conveyed to his sister. Her resolution, however, remained unshaken. If one's heart were once to deviate from the path, she reflected, the only end we could expect would be a damaged reputation and misery for life. The good and the bad result from oneself. Thus thinking, she resolved to return no answer. She might indeed have admired the person of Genji, and probably did so, yet whenever such feelings came into her mind, the next thought that suggested itself was, what is the use of such idle admiration? Meanwhile, Genji was often thinking of paying a visit to the house where she was staying, but he did not consider it becoming to do so, without some reasonable pretext, more especially as he would have been sorry, and for her sake more than his own, to draw a suspicion upon her. It happened, however, after a prolonged residence at the court, that another occasion of closing the palace in a certain celestial line of direction arrived. Catching at this opportunity, he left the palace, and suddenly turning out of his road, went straight to Ki no Kami's residence, with the excuse that he had just discovered the above fact on his way. Ki no Kami, surprised at this unexpected visit, had only to bow before him, and acknowledge the honour of his presence. The boy Kokimi was already there before him, having been secretly informed of his intention beforehand, and he attended on him as usual in his apartment on his arrival. The lady, who had been told by her brother that the prince earnestly desired to see her, knew well how dangerous it was to approach an inviting flower growing on the edge of a precipice. She was not, of course, insensible to his coming in such a manner, with an excuse for the sake of seeing her, but she did not wish to increase her dream-like inquietude by seeing him. And again, if he ventured to visit her apartment, as he did before, it might be a serious compromise for her. For these reasons she retired while her brother was with Genji to a private chamber of Chiûjiô, her companion, in the rear of the main building, under the pretence that her own room was too near that of the prince. Besides, she was indisposed and required tataki, which she desired to have done in a retired part of the house. Genji sent his attendants very early to their own quarters, and then, through Kokimi, requested an interview with the lady. Kokimi at first was unable to find her, till after searching everywhere, he at last came to the apartment of Chiûjiô, and with great earnestness endeavoured to persuade her to see Genji, in an anxious and half trembling voice; while she replied in a tone slightly angry, "What makes you so busy? Why do you trouble yourself? Boys carrying such messages are highly blamable." After thus daunting him, she added more mildly, "Tell the prince I am somewhat indisposed, and also that some friends are with me, and I cannot well leave them now." And she again cautioned the boy not to be too officious, and sent him away from her at once. Yet at the bottom of her heart different feelings might have been struggling from those which her words seemed to express, and some such thoughts as these shaped themselves in her mind: were I still a maiden in the home of my beloved parents, and occasionally received his visits there, how happy might I not be? How trying to act as if no romantic sentiment belonged to my heart! Genji, who was anxiously waiting to know how the boy would succeed in persuading his sister, was soon told that all his efforts were in vain. Upon hearing this, he remained for some moments silent, and then relieved his feelings with a long drawn sigh, and hummed, "The hahaki gi, distant tree, spreads broom-like o'er the silent waste. Approach! How changed its shape we see, in vain we try to shade, to taste." The lady was unable to sleep, and her thoughts also took the following poetic shape: "Too like the hahaki gi tree, lonely and humble I must dwell, nor dare to give a thought to thee, but only sigh a long farewell." All the other inmates of the house were now in a sound slumber, but sleep came not to Genji's eyes. He did, indeed, admire her immovable and chaste nature, but this only drew his heart the more towards her. He was agitated. At one moment he cried, "Well, then!" At another, "However!" "Still!" At last, turning to the boy, he passionately exclaimed, "Lead me to her at once." Kokimi calmly replied, "It is impossible, too many eyes are around us." Genji, with a sigh, then threw himself back on the cushion, saying to Kokimi, "You at least will be my friend, and shall share my apartment." End of section 3.